We've come here tonight to hear Margaret Hellyer talk about her latest book on a home on the South Fork, an early history of Acme and Northwest Washington community. Margaret was born in Bellingham, grew up in Acme. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Visual Communications from Western Washington University with an emphasis in graphic design and photography. And if you don't own her book yet, you'll want to, because she did an amazing job on it and put many, many years of research into this. So please help me welcome Margaret Hellyer.
Thank you, Carol. A Home on the South Fork is a story about the early settlement of the Whatcom County community of Acme, which is east of Bellingham on the South Fork of the Nooksack River. I call it an early history because it covers the time frame of first European American settlement in 1883 through roughly the Depression years. By then, the community and its businesses had reduced in size once the timber was depleted and jobs in the woods and mills no longer existed to support the local economy. The photograph on the book's cover, which you can see behind me, shows one of Acme's earliest homestead families on their land. The family was displaying everything they had of value at that time for the photographer: their home and outbuildings, their cleared land and fences, their 2 horses, and a herd of skinny cattle. When you consider that the cattle didn't have cleared fields with lush grass to eat in those early years, they probably ate anything they could find, including ferns and weeds, stickers, whatever was there. On the far left, a large barn was halfway completed at the time of the photo. It was built using heavy wooden pegs that held the beams together. If you follow the fence line back to the young woman leaning against the gate, that's my grandmother, Melinda, or Minnie, as she preferred to be called. Her father, my great-grandfather, A.A. Galbraith, is to her right. Her mother, my great-grandmother, Henrietta, is seated next to the cabin. And Minnie's 5 siblings are in the yard, my great-aunt and great-uncles. There's a lot of my DNA in this photo, and that connection to these people and this area is why I have an interest in Acme. So I got a crazy idea that I would write a book about its history, given the fact that my grandmother, my father, and I all grew up there. Being the organized person that I am, I figured this project would take me 3 years to complete. The first year I'd do research, the second year I'd write it, and the third year I'd do the design and production of the book, since I'm a graphic designer. Well, that was almost 20 years ago. What I didn't account for was having to do all this while working a full-time job, and I had a life outside of work. I spent one of those years recovering from an accident where I barely touched the project. There were other years where I had little time, thinking I would do it when I retired. But I always thought about it. I kept thinking about the material I had, knowing it would make an interesting book. I also wanted to get this information out there before it was lost forever, as so much of it was one of a kind, and so many people had contributed their information, and they were anxiously awaiting this book. They were my shareholders, needing the reassurance of an annual status report. Many of them passed on in the meantime, and I always felt bad each time that happened. It gave me a sharp nudge to pick up the pace for a while after each death. I finally fell into a pattern that worked for me. As soon as fall came and the cold, wet weather arrived, I found it was easier to stay indoors after I got home from work, where I'd been locked to a computer all day. I was then locked to my own computer for the rest of the day and long into the night. Then in the spring, when the nice days pulled me outside and I had to divert my attention to yard work and other matters, I'd stop working on the book until fall came again. So this went on for several years and allowed me to make progress on the book, albeit slowly, while still keeping up with my own life, more or less, and working a full-time job. Needless to say, Things took a lot longer than I thought, but I never lost sight of my goal. I wanted to make a book that was interesting. I wanted it to read like a good story, but be factual. I wanted to make a history book that kids in school would enjoy, because I never liked history in school. I found it too dry, too boring, I couldn't relate. I wanted to make a book that I wanted to read, a book with lots of pictures and true stories that held my interest. And very importantly, I wanted to get this amazing material I'd collected out to the world before it disappeared forever as people passed on and moved away, taking their old photos and family stories with them. Along the way, I learned two very important things. First, I learned that recorded history is full of mistakes. They're everywhere. So I worked hard to avoid making new mistakes, and I tried not to perpetuate existing mistakes if I found them. In order to do that, I tried to go to the original sources for information that I used, and that required a lot of digging and detective work, but I found I enjoyed that part of it. The second thing I discovered in this process was that it's easy to make assumptions. Making assumptions leads to mistakes, and it's easy to think you know what happened in a given situation. So as I wrote, I would constantly ask myself, how do I know this? Am I just thinking this is what happened? Or do I have information that tells me this? I was always checking my source information to affirm what I wrote in order to be as accurate as possible. That meant I spent a great deal of time creating citations for my sources. I wanted my reader to know where this information was from if they were interested. And citations were really important as they validated my research and credited my sources. This project was a journey from beginning to end, and I'm relieved to finally be done and happy that I can now share this with you. Even though the focus of the story is about the community of Acme, this is Whatcom County history, and it covers a broad range of topics relevant to the county's development. So I hope you enjoy it. Now I'm going to show you some of the great images that are inside the book. I purchased this map on eBay. It was produced in 1895, which is 4 years after the railroad went through the South Fork Valley and 12 years after the first settlers arrived. This drawing shows the loop passengers could take from the towns on Bellingham Bay to the South Fork by way of Sumas, and shows Acme relative to what later became Bellingham. So right there is Acme, east of Bellingham, or at that time it wasn't Bellingham, it was Whatcom, Fairhaven, Seaholm. There's Lake Whatcom. And to go into the Bay cities, you would take the train here, starting in Acme, you would go all the way to Sumas, change trains, come down to Whatcom. When you were done with your shopping, get on the train, go down to Cedar Woolley on a different train, change trains, and come back on the Seattle Lake Shore and Eastern back to Acme. And that was considered great progress. It used to take 2 days one way to go into Whatcom. Before people could homestead or purchase land from the government, it had to be officially surveyed. This photograph of a survey crew heading out on a job was sent to me by a relative in Illinois. The man in the center is related to us. That's Isaac McFarland Galbraith, or Mac Galbraith, as he was known to the family. He was the compassman on the original federal survey of Township 37 North, Range 5 East, which included the Acme area. That survey took place in 1885, which is probably when this photo was taken. Well before European Americans arrived in the area, the Nooksack Indians called it home. Their territory included all 3 branches of the Nooksack River to their headwaters. They came up the South Fork every year to fish and processed the fish by smoking, as you can see in this photo. They had fish camps in certain areas. This camp was probably on land that was later homesteaded by the Galbraith family. My dad would go with his mother, Minnie, to watch the Nooksack spear salmon, split them, hang them up, and smoke them when he was just a young boy. It's probable that she took this photo or her sister Naomi took the photo, as they both were interested in photography in those early years. When the first settlers arrived, the South Fork Valley was extremely rugged and isolated. It was an endless job to clear land and build a home, and not everybody was cut out for it. And I want to read you something that relates to that. 6 months after arriving in Washington Territory with his daughters Sally Cox and Henrietta Galbraith and her family, 67-year-old William N. Cox was already experiencing trouble in his quest to secure a claim for himself. A letter home, mailed from the Park Post Office, revealed his concerns and the need for some cash. Park, Washington Territory, 17 December, 1886. Stayed at lake last night, will leave pretty soon for home. The pony will be along directly for me to ride. Dear son, just sailed some 2 miles across the lake to the Squires to get my papers fixed up. Have had a hard time in getting it done. My check vouchers will come to Mill Spring, Tennessee, as I instructed that way. Look out and send them to me in some safe way. Try and add some to my check, as I am very needing shoes and clothes. I need badly. Cannot live here without something to eat and wear. So it is everywhere else. Sally and I each have a good quarter of land. If we can only hold on long enough to secure the titles, we will have to have some help. I am not able to go out and hire to work. 3 short weeks later, William wrote his son again. Concern over his clothing situation and isolation had grown. He urged Joseph to send him money so he could go back home. William's dream of owning land had been overridden by the hard reality of life in the wilderness. The location William noted in his next letter, preceding the date, gives some indication of the conditions in the valley. Mud Hole, 5th January, 1887. My dear son, will try and write you a little tonight. I am suffering a good deal, not well at all. Bladder and kidneys hurting me considerably. My breast also. We'll have to get away from here. Do not want to die in this wild woods so far from anywhere. Could not be buried decently. Does not suit an old man here, not a weakly one at least, unless he has plenty of money to keep himself comfortable. Now, Joe, I want you to go to work right away and get $30 or $40 and send it to me. It will help me to get a ticket to get home. Borrow a little if you can. Soon as I am able and the roads are good and clear, I want to start for home, by the 1st of April, anyhow. I wish I was at my old home. Hope and trust I will be there soon. I think my children will surely help me to get back to my old home, there to die and be buried with my people. And it will not be many years that I can be in this world. My 70 nearly run out the time allotted to many. Send Sally a good pair of shoes if you possibly can, number 5.5. She is nearly barefooted. Send my money as soon as you can, as I am nearly naked. Papa. But the money was not forthcoming. After 8 months of living in the valley, William N. Cox realized that proving up on a land claim was much more difficult than he had bargained for or could possibly manage. A resolve to get home had replaced his desire to own land. Despite having survived service in the Civil War, including a gunshot wound to the foot and capture by the Yankees, William found himself defeated by age, his health, and the difficulty of pioneer life in the South Fork Valley. William was my great-great-grandfather. When the first settlers started moving into the South Fork Valley, there was no easy way to get there. They would either hire Indians to take them in canoes up the Nooksack with all their belongings, or they'd have to hire a wagon to carry their stuff from the town of Whatcom, now called Bellingham, over to Geneva on Lake Whatcom. Then they'd have to row boats the length of the lake, 12 miles to Park, which was the head of the lake. That would take a full day. They'd stay overnight there at an outpost and rest up before continuing a rugged 8 or 9 mile hike on foot up the South Fork Valley to what became Acme. This photo shows Fred Zober's store and outpost. He's standing out front. His wife, Maddie, is holding their firstborn child on the porch. Fred and his brother eventually ran a pack train service to the valley in the 1880s, and that's probably what we're looking at. They hauled mail and supplies, and they also brought people in. Mary McDaniel came to the valley from Texas as an unmarried woman in 1884. She joined her relatives in the valley and soon took up a homestead claim of her own. She married Tom Stevens, another early settler, and their log cabin became the site of Acme's first post office. Mary was the first postmaster and is credited with naming the town because it had to have a name to have a post office. Within a year of her marriage to Tom Stevens, Mary gave birth to the first child born to settlers in Acme. Their daughter Mabel is seen here on the steps of her parents' log cabin in 1891. In time, settlers claimed and cleared all available land in the area. This shows early Acme looking northwest towards Stewart Mountain. It was taken from about where the current store is. The railroad tracks and the siding are still there. The train depot is just behind the house in the foreground. The train depot is not there anymore. Stumps and logs still litter yards such as they were at the time. 100+ years ago, the weather was a lot colder than it is now. Lake Whatcom used to freeze over completely each winter. Temperatures below zero were not uncommon. This image shows the water tower for the Acme depot during a cold snap. I had a postcard of this picture, but had no idea it was Acme until a relative showed me the original photo, which was this. My great-grandfather, A.A. Galbraith, is on the right, with two of his sons, about 1893. Trees of unimagined size lined the valley floor when settlers first arrived. Once they had a rail outlet to market the timber and its products, namely shingles, the local economy took off. There was a great deal of cedar on the valley floor, and logging camps and mills processed it into shingles as fast as it could be brought in. Shingle mills sprung up everywhere in Whatcom County. Trees would be cut down by hand, then sawed into 4-foot sections. Each section was split into quarters, such as these, and those quarters were called shingle bolts. I cringe every time I look at that photo and those men with their bare hands handling those big cedar bolts, which they probably did all day long, every day. Shingle bolts were loaded onto wagons or sleds, such as this one, where teams of oxen or horses would drag them over skid roads to mills or landing sites. This small-scale operation in Acme shows how primitive some skid roads were. It only required some clearing and small logs placed perpendicular to the trail to make the road usable. Douglas fir was also valued, but often shipped out by rail for processing elsewhere. This wagon photo was taken with another photo and shows teams of at least 8 horses pulling it down Turkington Road. I can't imagine how strong those wooden wheels were to not collapse under that weight. The peak of the 2-room Acme school, grade school, can be seen to the right. It's in the same location as the current Acme grade school. The last shingle mill built in Acme was named the Morona Mill. It specialized in producing red cedar shingles and provided employment for many local people, even kids who were hired to nail shingle bands. Those bands held the pack of shingles together so they could send them out for shipment by rail. In 1930, the Wood Acme Logging Company built a rail incline up Stewart Mountain. This photo was taken at the base of the mountain, not far from the Morona Mill. An incline donkey would pull the empty rail cars up the mountainside, and in the mornings they'd also pull the crew up there. And then the logging crew at the top would fill the cars with logs, then the incline donkey would lower the logs to the mill, or they'd be shipped by rail to some other location. This is a rare photograph. I've never seen another one like this. It shows the view near the top of the incline looking down. You can see how uneven and steep that slope was. Turkington Road can be seen on the valley floor. The first school in the South Fork Valley was held in this log cabin, which had been built by a man named T.A. Cate, and I never did see what the initials T.A. stood for, but men back then often used just their first 2 initials. My great-grandfather acquired the cabin after Cate left the area, and he let School District Number 8 hold its first classes there starting in 1888. There were only 9 students in the entire district, which covered an 84-square-mile area ranging from Skagit County in the south to the Van Zandt area in the north. Once Acme School District Number 69 was established in 1894, after it split from Saxon District Number 8, this 1-room schoolhouse was built. It's on the same land along the Turkington Road as the current Acme grade school. By 1904, the number of students at the Acme School had outgrown the 1-room schoolhouse, so a 2-room schoolhouse was built to take its place. I was told the students sat in rows according to their grade. Even if only 1 kid was in that grade, they sat in their own row. This photo was taken in 1908. The first church to be organized in Acme was the Presbyterian Church. This photo shows the church as it nears completion about 1902. It was built on Highway 9, just south of the bridge. Settlers also started a Methodist church very early, and I think that was built around 1903 or 4. The Sabbath was taken very seriously in those days, but kids weren't always as enthusiastic about Sundays as their elders. And I want to read you something that I wrote after my cousin Gail interviewed her uncle, my great-uncle, Audley Galbraith Jr., who's named after his dad. In the A.A. Galbraith household, when not in Sunday school, the children were expected to spend Sundays in quiet contemplation of the Sabbath. It was not a day of work or play. As in many other homes, Sabbaths were strictly observed. The children would clean up and then be seated while Henrietta read Sunday school papers sent by her sister in Tennessee. In recalling the trials of being a youth during those early Sabbaths, Audley Galbraith Jr. said, "Good behavior was stressed. If you did anything wrong, God knew it." He also added, "I'd much rather be whipped than endure Sundays." That was my favorite quote in the whole book. I have a lot of quotes. A Swiss immigrant named Fred Zobrist started the first store in Acme. This, his second store there, was located at the intersection of Highway 9 and Galbraith Road, near the railroad crossing. The lower level was a store and also had the second post office in Acme. The top floor was a hotel, which his family lived in for several years before they built the home nearby. All three of Zobrist's children were born in the hotel, and 2 of those 3 are on the front porch in this photo. Amy Linnell is the woman at the far left, and Minnie Galbraith, who clerked at the store, is sitting behind wearing her work apron. 2 features which remain constant in Acme to this day are the railroad tracks and Highway 9. This view looks north about where the tracks cross the highway now, just to the right. The spur line that you see off to the left in the distance went to nearby mills. That line is no longer there, but the highway and tracks are in exactly the same place. Here you can see the depot in the distance and the Presbyterian Church, which is across the highway on the right side. Fred Zobrist's third and last store is the large 2-story structure in the middle of the photo. The store is still there, although the top story has since been removed. This is a typical view of the inside of an early country store. This happens to be Lawson Parker's store. He and his family moved to the area from Indiana about 1901 and built the store on Turkington Road. It changed hands several times over the next few years and eventually became the Hoffman Brothers store, which operated into the 1930s and gave Fred Zobrist's store a little competition. This is Fred Zobrist's third store in Acme with its distinctive roof line when it had both floors. Acme had several lodges which used the upstairs hall as a meeting place. And the community used it for everything, from dances to dinners to lectures on topics of the day by visiting speakers. The top floor was eventually torn off. The modified bottom story is still in use as Acme's current store. Acme even had its own cornet band. It could be a pretty swinging place. This ad appeared in the local paper in 1912. MWA stood for Modern Woodmen of America, and Acme Lodge. They conducted meetings and events in the hall above Zobrist's store. Local farmers established the Acme Dairy Association, which was a cooperative group. The association bought milk and cream from Valley residents, then produced cheese and butter, which they shipped out by rail to sell. The building was located on Highway 9, a little north of Zobrist's store. In 1916, Fred and Mattie Zobrist sold the building that had been their second store and hotel to a man named Peter Johnson. Johnson ran the building as a hotel for some years and is probably the one who added the covered balcony around the building. Highway 9 is in the foreground and had been paved by the time this photo was taken. Joe Kelly, a Civil War veteran originally from Indiana, arrived in Acme on December 4th, 1908. He was a Midwestern newspaper man who came to town to start his dream of publishing his own paper. He's shown here standing in front of his office on Highway 9. The Acme Prospector was a 4-page newspaper with local news on the front and back sides and regional and national news on the inside. Local businesses were regular advertisers. Before Facebook, people socialized in person. The Valleys were the local baseball team, probably based in Acme as they were known for their good field, and they traveled as far as Marietta and Ferndale, so they would have gotten around on a train in those days to play those teams from those places. Claude Dickey is the man on the left. I don't know who the man on the right is. Those are strings of trout in the foreground, and they would have preserved those by smoking, more than likely. The arrival of the railroad in the South Fork Valley was a life-changing event for the people there. The Seattle Lake Shore and Eastern Railway finally went through in 1891. This photograph was taken in 1898 at the Acme Depot. The depot included a freight room, an office with a telegraph, and a ticket sales area, in addition to a waiting room. Henrietta Galbraith is on the left, next to her sister Sally Bruns and 3 other family members, probably going into Whatcom for the day. This is one of my favorite photos. The writer is a woman, and you'll notice, despite being in the middle of nowhere, she's practicing good writing etiquette by sitting side saddle while balancing a heavy sack of some kind. She's probably on what later became part of Highway 9 between Acme and Park. As early as 1885, settlers in the South Fork Valley were petitioning the Whatcom County commissioners for a road from Park to Acme. Once the commissioners granted approval, the settlers then had to build the road themselves using hand tools. It was a long and arduous process. In this scene, the men are widening the roadway just south of Acme. Eventually, the road extended to the north of Acme. This driver's seat view was taken at Standard, a small community between Acme and Clipper. By June 1904, Whatcom County only had 6 automobiles. Most people didn't own a car for several years after that. But auto stages ran as soon as the roads were good enough for them to get around. And a lot of people used those if they weren't taking the train, such as this first gas stage from Bellingham to Deming, as seen in 1907. This scene was probably along the Mount Baker Highway, known then as the Northeast Diagonal Road. In the spring of 1917, Whatcom County commissioners passed a resolution to improve the highway with a permanent surface between Deming and Wickersham. A British Columbia contractor, Lettingham and Cooper, took gravel for paving the road from the river near Acme, using a skyline and a steam donkey with drag buckets, as seen here. Young men, such as Ralph Zobrist, had jobs running converted Model T Fords back and forth to the road paving machines with gravel. These cars had a dump bed that flopped backwards, sliding the gravel into the paving machines. The last part of the paving was finished in the early 1920s. At one time, Acme had its own doctor and even its own pharmacy. Dr. Ed Lane Brinson moved to town in 1911 and was kept busy tending to all the injuries in the mills and on farms. He also delivered babies, prescribed medication, and did everything else a country doctor would do in those days. The first bridge over the South Fork in Acme was a wooden wagon bridge with a superstructure built of Washington fir. It was completed around 1895. Prior to having a bridge, settlers would cross the river on foot using the railroad bridge or log jams, waded if shallow enough, or use a canoe if they had one. This view shows a collection of shingle bolts in a backwater awaiting processing. The second bridge in Acme was made of steel and can be seen in this view looking north along Highway 9. If you've ever lived in Acme, you know floods are an almost yearly event. The first settlers had to contend with that as well, and it made a mess of the dirt roads. One of the chapters in this book is about all the other little communities that were Acme's neighbor, because people traveled up and down the valley to do business with their neighbors, and they might have something you didn't have in your town. I wrote a brief history of each, including Wickersham, which is seen in this 1893 photo. Other communities I covered included Park, and I went up the valley as far as Deming. Deming had a number of businesses. Like all small towns in that area, it got its biggest jump start from timber and the mills, which provided employment. Deming also became the center of the area's school system, which eventually consolidated with all the small schools in the South Fork Valley. as I was working on this, I struggled with a lot of material I had that just didn't fit into the earlier chapters. The events took place 2 or 3 generations later, and there was no easy way to transition it. Yet I'd done a lot of interviews and had some wonderful material that I wanted to include. So I ended up creating a new chapter called Coming of Age, Growing Up in the 20s and 30s. And that allowed me to include information about that generation and the changes they witnessed in their lives, like the advent of modern appliances and their particular social activities, which differed from their parents and grandparents. We're lucky to have local archives with a wealth of information for researchers. The Regional Archives and the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies are co-located near Seaholm High School and Western. Their staff's really helpful. You just need to contact them by phone or even email, make an appointment if you want to go in to see what their holdings are, look something up. In this case, in this day, I was tracing a chain of ownership for some Acme businesses, and the young woman that was helping me, Allison Costanza, one of the archivists there, was a very petite woman, and she must have got her workout that day hauling those heavy books back and forth, and just was fantastic to work with. I'd like to talk a little bit about the production of the book. Since I'm a graphic designer, it's the part of the process that I knew the best. One of the things I wanted to do was make a map showing the early locations of significance, such as the schools, the different store locations, the mills, the newspaper office, and so on. I'd always been interested in knowing where those things used to be, so I sketched out this map with what I knew. I later refined the map and added new locations after speaking with people who remembered where other things were. I also included some of the early family homes up to about 1935 as people gave me that information. Then I scanned my map and built a more accurate map in the computer using Adobe Illustrator, continuing to add detail and refining the scale while adding geographic features in Photoshop. Several years ago, LiDAR imaging became available to the public, so I looked up the South Fork Valley online and copied this portion of a LiDAR image of the Acme area. I then superimposed my existing art over the top. And that allowed me to pinpoint the old Wood Acme logging incline relative to Turkington Road, and also the large Morona Mill Pond, as those areas had not yet been disturbed by development. So the scale and location were extremely accurate for that, as well as location of the roads and the railroad, because that never changed. The finished map appears in the front of the book for reference to those places and many others. I had decided ahead of time what images I wanted to use at the beginning of each chapter. Each image had to represent the chapter's content and be a great photo. The hard part is shown in this view, after I lay out the chapter head and write the caption and was facing nothing but a blank page. I guess that 99.9% of the people who write a book don't do it this way, but I'm a designer and that's how it worked best for me, and it allowed me to tie the copy into the images. So using my layout as a guide, I wrote the copy as I went along. Writing was probably the most challenging part of the book for me. Here I was partway through the chapter about communications and adding images and copy along the way. I created the book in Adobe InDesign. I scanned and prepared the images to fit however I needed them and converted them to grayscale after I determined which ones I'd use. I bought a book on indexing, and while that didn't make me an expert, it helped me assemble an index using some basic standards. This photo was taken after I'd written everything, it had been proofed, and I was going through it page by page, creating the index, which you can see on the right half of the screen. For the cover, I wanted to use an image that represented the topic of the book. I had this photo in mind before I'd even started because it was so perfect for that, and for me. The only color I used was on the cover, where I tried to replicate the sepia tones of an old photograph and make it kind of warm. Here I've designed the front and back covers, but don't yet have the ISBN number, which I ordered and then placed electronically. I had to figure out how to do a lot of those things as I went along because I'd never designed a book before, nor had I written one, but I'd read a book before, so I knew what they looked like. My most important tool during this project was dark chocolate. Got me through many hours.
Yes, you started off talking about, I think it was your great-grandfather, or was it your great-great-grandfather that wanted to go home so badly?
That was my great-great-grandfather.
Did he go home?
Well, you'll have to read the book to find that out.
So, all right. Do you know if any photos exist of the Wickersham roller skating rink?
You know, there must be, because that thing was going for a while, and he asked about the Wickersham skating rink. They used to have a skating rink there, and when I was young, I remember going there with my aunt at least once. I would think someone does. I didn't come across one. Of all the people I interviewed, and I used a lot of different people's photos, I was not able to, I never did see one, but I'm sure there's some out there. I just don't know where.
Are you related to the Galbraith of Galbraith Mountain?
Well, you know, that mountain, I think, acquired that as a nickname. I don't think that's its original name, and it acquired that because the two youngest Galbraith children in this family formed the Galbraith Brothers Logging Company, and they were up there logging for many years, and so I think people just attached that name to it. I'm not sure about that, but I'm pretty sure that's how it ended up that way.
Are you related to the Galbraith, the winner of the Mount Baker Marathon?
Yeah, Joe. He's one of my grandmother's brothers. Yeah. So the two of the boys formed Galbraith Brothers Logging. Joe was in it for a while, and then he became a farmer. He liked that better. And then there was another brother, and he did farming also, and then a sister and my grandmother. So they had 6 kids altogether. The youngest 2 were born on the homestead that you see in the front cover. Yeah.
So I just found out that apparently there was a huge depression in 1912 when San Francisco got done rebuilding from the fire and the earthquake, and that's one reason why some of these small communities kind of dried up. Did you find that happening in your book?
No, what they did is they logged all the timber off. They first logged it all out of the valley, out of the bottomlands, the timber that was easy to access, and then they would move further and further away, further and further inland as they logged, and eventually there was just no more marketable timber to log. What was left was very high up and hard to get, so if they had no timber, they couldn't feed the mills. The mills started shutting down. There were no jobs for men in the woods. So they left, they took their families with them, so the town shrunk down.
I don't really have a question, but I'm about halfway done with your book, and I think it's excellent.
Thank you.
It's a great resource. The pictures are wonderful, and the layout's great, and
going.
Congratulations. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks very much.